Awesome. Welcome, everybody, to the Vision Train. I am here with Miles Seiden. My name is Alicia Sacred Heart. We're here to share about branding for artists and a course that Miles created with ViTra Academy and is now remastered and available for you to study at your own pace. Um, and welcome, Miles, and welcome everybody else that's here.
Thank you.
Whether you're here on the Zoom call with us or watching the live stream or replay recording anywhere, wherever you are, we're glad you found your way here. Miles, so what is the importance of building a visual language for somebody, for an artist specifically?
Well, it's often hard to look within when you're just trying to produce. You might be working on a piece and you kind of take that and compartmentalize it and don't relate it back to yourself. Like I find it hard sometimes too to discover what my style is. But if you can merge those different fields of art and design, art being, maybe less commercial in its nature, it's more of a personal thing with design where you're usually working on behalf of someone else. The fusion of those two things can really help focus like even your practice. So, I mean, I see this as something you're investigating your own identity because ultimately that is what a logo is an entry point for. And then from that place, everything else that surrounds it, it's like, when you have a muscle that's not quite well used, you have to build up the muscles around it. So we're really talking about creating a system of elements for yourself that you can carry into the world. You can build trust. That's a huge component of why you create an identity in the first place. And it's also about raising your own consciousness about yourself and others' consciousness about who you are and who you're really wanting to be. So, I view this as something that's a little more broad than just a commercial exercise, although it is something that is a business decision because you have to invest in yourself, in learning about who you are, and then also creating all the materials that are going to go forward. So as you scale any enterprise, like from a personal business, so that's more of a one-on-one thing, to if you end up having employees that are also working with you, to present more of a unified appearance. And also, of course, everything backing that, you really want it to be a thoughtful and unified appearance. You can begin to convey what you want about yourself. So longer answer probably than expected, but
Well, how did you get to learn so much about this?
so, my path is really from a place of I always had wanted to be an artist when I was like 5 years old. I wanted to work for Disney actually. That was the earliest path. I wanted to do animation, and I was on that kind of a track. And I took graphic design in college. Part of it was because I was like, well, what might be lucrative as a career? Like I was afraid at that point of being an artist. So I really admire people that do that hustle and have built uh, a working life for themselves being an artist. So I did go on the design track for that reason, and now I've come back to art. But that was the point where I really was like, okay, I'm going to go on this track, and it's all become interrelated at this point, but that's where I went. Did, exhibition design, and experience design. So, if it was like from museums to events and headquarters and things like that. And then veered off of that into branding. So that was a short stint that I was in experiential design, although it still pops up with trade shows and whatnot. But yeah, I ended up going to Siegel and Gale. I'll show that in a moment in the presentation. But yeah, which is a really incredible branding agency. One of these ones that a lot of corporations and organizations will go to for their expertise. They're the simplicity company, so they're very much about that simpler identity, keeping the communication clear, things like that. So, and I was able to really traverse a lot of the different departments. So I wasn't just in design, I also did production and I did new business and I did strategy and I did naming and all that is kind of rolled up into what a brand is, like creating that entity. So, I think that really informs also your design. So it's not just about you making something pretty and cute, but something that really is useful for you that says something about who you are. So you really want to do this consciously.
Yeah, and I also feel like there's just such an interesting opportunity that you have, like with some of the prompts that you had in the course, really interesting opportunities for us to reflect on what kind of symbolism, and you were referring to them as like monikers often. And but I also, like, I'm thinking like, this is so ancient, these like symbols that we come to identify with, like the cartouche, like the Egyptian hieroglyphic cartouche, and these symbols that, ultimately, form a visual language that represents the kind of morals and beliefs and passions and things that we wish to emulate in the world, and so it's like such a cool opportunity to be able to, really inspect what that might be for you, to really come into alignment with symbology that feels like it's uniquely you, and something that you want to bring to the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a landscape of this language that we almost take for granted. It's become the status quo to see so many brands, and every time there is some sort of acquisition or merger, we see something new, and we see these brands evolving, especially today. There's some with a lot of longevity that have been able to keep their identities, but it's really rare. Things are changing a lot. So, this isn't something that's necessarily fixed, but there is a huge history to this. And it's really back to the original mark making. So, it's almost like a branch, art and design, went in these kind of different directions, and there's been more computerization, if you will, or digitization of where design is, but there's also some art moving back into it. So it's interesting to see how these fields are kind of playing with each other, but they really have the same ancestor, which is the original mark making, and then using that mark to express something that feels either personal in the case of a individuated brand, or something that is a corporate body, right? So more people under one umbrella of an identity, and how you ladder up to that with everyone involved.
Right, that makes sense. So we have the course is it has basically three movements, right? If I remember correctly.
It does. So, offhand, I think it's immersion, ideation, and implementation, which,
Yes.
this is excerpted from what could be a really robust process. And that's what you'll find in the course. I've gone pretty wide with this to give a sense of what you could do. And I definitely recommend, taking as many steps as feels comfortable for you with your particular time frame. I mean, if you're trying to knock something out, you could do that, but you want it to have some lasting value for yourself. So, just like anything else, it's worth doing a little bit of planning, a little bit of strategy, and allowing that to be the foundation for something visual. Because if you just do something that is, really quick, it may not be that entry point. And I'll keep using that term because a logo is not really meant to be everything. It's not the kitchen sink. So that's why you want a whole system of elements, because a logo shouldn't and can't do everything that you want. It's really that first glimpse into something. And then over time, once the equity of that asset is built up, then it becomes something that's familiar and something that might signify something that you put into it. So it could be quality, like this person is all about quality, or the different attributes that you want to be, and that comes as part of a strategic process, like discovering who you are, and then putting that, or at least one perspective on that, into the logo. And then everything else helps support that, like how you message. So you're really creating a system. You don't want to do this necessarily in isolation. You could, but I think that there are ways to do this where it's really going to be more effective for how you present yourself.
And I also wanted to mention too that we have scheduled a live session that we'll have with anybody that registers for the course between now and then. Will be welcome to join this live session that Miles is going to offer. It's going to be on Saturday, June 15th at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central European. So, that'll be a little bit, maybe we'll be a little check back in with you guys on any work that you've done with the course, get feedback from Miles. Not sure exactly what all Miles might have up his sleeve for that day, but there will be a live session on June 15th. Let me go ahead and put that in the chat as well.
Yeah, so we talked about this being something like an office hours, where it will be more about you than me, less about presentation and more about responding and refining. So, bring everything and don't be shy, because this stuff is rough. It doesn't need to be polished. It can be in whatever phase. We could talk about words, because I'll give a little more background, but I mean, I've been in visuals and verbals for a long time. So I do quite a bit of writing as well and strategy. So, we can talk about any aspect of that's the most, vexing problem for you, or just like, hey, here's this piece. How do I scale this? Because there's a lot of considerations too, beyond just the creation of a logo. Like, how are you going to use it? Is this something that's going to go on signage? Is it something that's going to be kept kind of small and you want the feeling of a boutique? And all of these considerations in how you do it are going to affect how much time you need to spend doing your communications. Because ultimately, that's what this is about. This is about sharing something of yourself, communication. That's at the root of this. So it's just an attractor. I'm not trying to downplay. Logos have significance and they certainly are powerful, but behind all of that is what you're trying to communicate. And that's the most important thing. And it can be obscure. There's so many variables. It really just depends on you. So, you can build this however you want. So that session is really for you to, be able to just chat and see where you're at and where you might want to go with it. These are great questions. Should we hop into the presentation?
Yes, let's do it.
Let's do it. So I cobbled all this together from all three. And so I'm just going to show some things to give a little taste test of this, some from each. So basically, yes, it's in 3 movements and each is edited from, I think each class is about 4 hours. And just bear with me on those. I had COVID at the time, so it was really interesting, providing a course at that, but it was super fun. This is packed with a bunch of information. So that's another thing we can do too in the office hours is if there's stuff that isn't as clear for you from the course, just because you don't have the opportunity to have a live session, some of that can be clarified because some stuff it can be a little bit more dense and you have to sit with it, especially with things like strategy. So, logos, we're all very comfortable as artists with the visual languages, but sometimes, maybe the writing could be challenging or, various aspects of that. So it goes from immersion, which is really how you're learning about yourself and understanding what a brand is, what a logo is, what an identity is, to ideation, which is that process of iteration, finding the pathways that work and don't. And the teachers I've really admired have reminded me to fail quickly. So, sketching all of your stuff, because most of it is not going to be good, or it's not going to be feeling right, just like painting or anything else, you'll eventually feel good about it. When there's a place that you need to pause and this is what you want to present. So ideation is that process, and then implementation, because you have to be able to use it in your actual communications and make it real. So before that point, it's really just notional. They're just ideas. and you've created something from nothing almost, but now it's about getting real. It's about how you put it into your layouts, how you use that system. And with that, we'll just go into the first part. So I've really sectioned this off in a similar way. I have rearranged some slides because, some parts will go more into depth and others, I'll just leave as little taste tests. Just a little more about me. Just wanted to say, why in the world should you trust this guy? He doesn't even have the same haircut. But that's something about brand too, that you can change aspects of yourself. It's an evolving thing. So, you'll still know me as me. There are certain things that will carry forward. And what are those things? But, this is basically a little bit of educational history at the top there. I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and that's where I really got steeped in design. They had a beautiful bookmaking program and all these sort of things. So more in the print world because the professors were of that time. But I did learn digital as I continued on, went to Pratt for a master's in communication design in New York. And my first was working at The Onion doing editorial graphics. So that was kind of fun, doing a lot of Photoshop satire and like USA Today style graphics. ESI design, it's changed now. It's a different entity, but it was very much experiential design. So a lot of interesting things in that realm, museums and whatnot. Siegel and Gale is where I really grew up, became a designer. It was a jumble of elements, and don't feel like you need to get it right at first because it's taken a while. Like I've done this for 20 some odd years. So, it's at first it's like juggling. It's like, what do I do with all of this? Like you've got all these elements, but you'll start to see the patterns and, work with certain principles of Gestalt, that full picture of everything. And it gets easier. The problems get harder, but the ways that you know how to navigate those problems get easier. And then this is currently where I spend a lot of time. It's IMP, so it's more on the implementation side, but we do a lot of creative stuff and presentations and stuff like that. And I've done a couple of ventures, but I'm just using the same framework as in the slide when I did this a couple years ago. These are some clients and things like that. So, just to show, especially when you work in design, like you get into all sort of niche areas. So there's been financial, there's been spiritual, there's been utility companies, airlines, all sorts of stuff, entertainment, a hotel. So anyway, and then here's some info too, if you want to screenshot that or whatever. So happy to chat more about this beyond the purview of the course and whatnot. And then just a little sampling of some things that I've done. Like this was super fun, this project. This is more in the iconography realm, but this is the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. It's near Yellowstone, so totally amazing place to go. Smithsonian, multiple museums, as you can see, that have incredible collections. I did do this for Ramdas many years ago, and there's a bunch of fun kind of stuff in here. So, all right, so just beginning with the foundation, here's where we are in the beginning of the process. It looks overwhelming. Oh my gosh, that first step, it is crazy. But, hopefully this will break down some of that stuff for you. It doesn't have to be so crazy. We're just going to work on breaking down those elements into components that are digestible. You can work on any of it. You can work on none of it. You can just go straight to the logo. This is just a suggestion for one path. And I do like to go the robust way. So that's just me. That's my personality. I'm going to push this as far as possible and then ratchet back. And I find that that's a little bit easier because you have more clay to work with. But if you want to go straight to logo, go for it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that, if you have it backed by something that's a little more expressive of your personal identity, if you've gone and done the work, whatever it might be, if you meditate, learn about yourself a little more, you're going to put something more authentic into what you produce rather than just doing, something that's pretty, but not so useful. So what is a brand? It's really a dynamic entity. I mean, this is something that changes, because even a corporation, right, comes from corpore, like the body. It's a body, and that doesn't stay the same. We have a lot of, nouns in language, especially in English, that really should be verbs. So, brand sounds like something that's fixed, but it's not. It's all of these things. It's the name, right? So it could be your name. And we do naming a little bit in the course. It's a little bit of a dose of that. I won't go into that today because that's a whole nother, area. But you know, do you use an artist name? Do you use your own name? The logo, of course, which is that first access point into who you are. The messaging, so writing will be a component of this, of course, because that's how we're going to present ourselves with the pairing of visuals and verbals. And then things that would support the logo. So it's a system of things like what are your colors? What are the type? What are the fonts that you use? And then things that you may not even think about, but things that do factor into a brand, things like people, the places where you inhabit. You got to think about where you're putting everything. Even money. I didn't put that here, but these are all things that make a difference as to how you're going to present yourself. So there's a little more than just, creating a logo. And then it's really, you don't own it once you put it out. It's how people perceive you, it's how people perceive that. So that's a brand. And this might be, how it looks like. This is your general environment. This is where you sit. All of the different folks that you're going to interact with. And it's worth considering all that up front before you do that. Not that you do your logo for someone else. I'm not saying that at all. Please don't. Please do it for you because it's your colors, but know that, people are going to receive it too. It's in and out. So that, when you share this, maybe someone doesn't like pink. I don't know. That could be a personal preference. And maybe that doesn't matter. But you want to think about how and why you're doing these things and not just do it. This is this is a robust branding process, just showing you of the things that you could consider as you're doing this. But essentially, when you decide that you're going to start, so that's the inception of the whole idea, and have like an organized process. This is how I tend to think. It could be totally scrambled, but you can always come back to this page and just revisit the things to get you to that place. And I've done this in the linear way because that's the easiest way to say it. But this is where you decide. This is where you get into yourself. Immersion. Inspiration is where you start looking at other things that you may want to reference because some giant has always done it really well. And maybe there are little cues you can pick up for rendering, for how they present themselves. Then there's, the fun process, the ideation, getting to see different pathways you could potentially take, and then what nets out from there, what shakes out. Then the implementation, which I find pretty fun, but it has its particularities. So you want to consider how you're putting things out, and then the launch, how you introduce it. So these are just some steps that you can take. This is a simplified chart for brown foundation. So some of the things that you might associate verbals with. I won't go too deep into this. This is more going to be elaborated in the course because you really could spend a lot of time just on this. But just the idea of having a purpose or like a central thesis to why you're doing this really helps you ground that. So the logo is in a particular context. And then, things like values and voice, like what you hold dear and how you want to express that is especially important for the angle of how you want to present your identity. So this is something that you could do. We could just take a couple of minutes and have a look at this. This is also in the course. But these are some things to think about, as you're starting. And this could help, and it could be just really loose. So if you want to like jot down some things, we can do some of this as an exercise just very quickly. So some questions to ask yourself, like it could be you. You might assume that it's just you, but is it going to be a larger entity? Do you see that like in some years you'll be having a staff? What are you presenting? What are you offering? And how do you convey that? So all these questions are good things to, look and consider. So maybe if we just take a couple minutes for that, we can talk about how we would translate that into an identity. Do you have any theme music we could put on?
Yes, I I can share a little bit of music, but I would have to stay unmuted because you're sharing your screen. But I can do that. We have, here we go. We'll give it just a few minutes, and you're asking us to consider who our audience may be.
That's it. So, I mean, this really goes along a row, you know. So, you ask that question, you declare who it is, you know, all the players, things that you might include that you wouldn't think about in your brand, just as a thought, not that you have to, but you know, these are just things to consider and just start to write down some of the stuff. So, a little construction noise, apologies. Uh, you know, so that you have a lot you can work with. You're starting to mold something, you're getting the raw material, you're going to put it together, so that there is some foundation to what you're doing. So yeah, I mean, this goes along, you know, what are you offering? Who should you consider for what may be beyond yourself, like peers? When will you do it? So if you were going to be full-time, you know, you might say something like that. If you're a part-time artist, you know, this goes into how you will be perceived or how you want to be perceived. I guess the construction is on this side today.
We can't hear it actually.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh,
background reduction because we can't hear it. I can't anyway. All right, well, let me pop on a little bit of music. We'll give it a couple minutes and let you guys consider. You hear the music all right?
All right. Well, hopefully you've written down everything about your life in 5 minutes. Don't worry if it's not all there. This can be totally messy. In fact, a lot of the processes, even with the large companies, go in a funky order. So, just it's always there for you, this particular slide to, sit with and consider these things. But it's a good first step. And the more you have some of this stuff down, the more will inform. So hopefully that's a good, launching point for you. So I know there's a lot to look at and there's only a little bit of time. I'm happy to extend for like 10, 15 minutes just because we had some technical stuff. If that works for you, Alicia, and everyone else,
Sure.
we can do that. And because I'm sure people are wondering, why are we talking about strategy? This is painting and logo class. But this is, I think, a huge component to helping you even get to that place. It almost lends itself. Like if you thought through certain things, it might even be like, oh, well, the logo is basically designed. I know I want to do this, this, and this. So, but now we're writing creative. So, what is a visual identity? So there is the logo, and that's what most people are accustomed to. But this is what we're really talking about is a system of things. It's not really just the logo because you're gonna have type. All logos pretty much have type unless they've got enough equity like Nike that you could just see that swoosh and know that it's them. But that takes a long time. And they've gone through a lot of evolution too. Even if the logo hasn't, there's been other things around it. And that's what I was talking about before. So it's like, you hurt your calf, you got to build up all the rest of the muscles to support that. Same thing here, right? So the logo is just that entry point, but has to be supported by other things. So we're talking about color palette. We're talking about imagery. So that could be like building a library or maybe taking your own. Like a lot of, companies use stock, but if they can afford it or they want to, they'll have a photographer do it. And the benefit of being an artist is that you could do some of that yourself, which I highly recommend if you can, because the more that you can make it proprietary, the more that it has that personality, especially in personal branding, right? So we're not creating a company quite yet. I mean, you could be if that's what you're, aiming toward. But if you're doing personal branding, you can be much more free in a sense because you don't have to be as universal. When you have a corporation, there's like, hundreds of employees or thousands of employees, they're going to have to treat it according to more strict guidelines. It has to communicate to more people. So it's a little bit safer. You can be more free. And also you could take cues from like your artwork if you have a particular style and you want to do that. So, the rendering of it doesn't have to be quite the same as like, always digital, always so clean and precise and minimal as it is with corporate branding. But typography will come into play, and these all might have cost associations to it, but you can get a lot of good stuff on like Google Fonts and like, if you have the Adobe suite, they've got Adobe fonts. So this has changed greatly over the years to have access to such a wide variety of fonts. Just making sure like, that it will actually work for you. And it's also conveying the things that you want to convey about yourself. Like you don't want to really stiff fonts if you're trying to be more humanistic, for instance. But so all of those elements together are orchestrated into something that's like a visual identity system or a brand identity system. There's a lot of different ways around saying the same thing, but it's all of these elements that are going to work in concert in your communications. So, when you notice like the Starbucks green, that's something that has gained equity over time, or the mermaids, I mean, these are things that become really recognizable. And when you see a green awning at every single corner, that's going to be Starbucks. So that's the equity that you want to get to in a sense, is something that's memorable and it's adaptable too, because it's in Seattle, but it's also all over the place. So it has to work in those environments. So I'm just going to run through some of these. These go in a lot more depth in the actual course. But sticking to the basics of color, obviously you don't want something this world. It's going to be a little more controlled, let's say, like you would have some core colors, but you're really building a palette. This could be your favorite colors. This could be, ones that really work in concert together. You might have an accent color that you use, only in certain instances. Like if you use red, you don't want to like flood everything with red because it gets a bit crazy. Black and white are always present, but you want some neutrals to soften things. You want some dominant colors that are really going to feel more like you. And I'll go back to that green again, right? So like the Starbucks green, the Tiffany blue, these kind of the UPS brown, these companies have really, Coca-Cola red, like they've really begun to own those colors in the way that they use them. So these are just considerations for that. Topography, I mean, this could very well be the most important part of design in general is how you treat topography. What are the weights? You can see it goes from thin to like really heavy. The widths, really condensed to really expanded. And now these days you have like variable fonts, which is awesome because you don't have to be relegated to just specific fonts that have been designed. There's all these in between. I mean, they've all been designed, but I mean, you can have something that's not specifically a bold weight. It could be a little less bold. So there's some flexibility in that, which is great. But how you create a hierarchy, so we're talking about title level all the way down to caption level, is going to be extremely important to consider because you want this to look consistent as well. The selection of the font, the pairing of fonts together, or typefaces is the broader category. A font is an instance of a typeface family. So like if you have a Helvetica, which people are used to, that's a particular style and a particular way that it's cut or shaped. Then you have all the different weights of that for emphasis and for different uses. So, it does get like technical in a sense, but there's a lot of good info out there about how that is. And so we don't go into that much depth on that because it's a whole world of its own too, and maybe a theme for another course. But this is really intended to give you a sense of all the parts of the system. Imagery, of course, things that are you want to think of the category. So, things that are human, things that are natural, if that's where you're leaning. What are the objects that you want to use? How do you present your art? So that could be you have mock-ups and things like that. And there are a lot of good resources for that too today. So you don't have to build all those yourself because that can get kind of crazy. But, just having a library that feels like it's got a similar theme. Maybe the way that you treat the light, like what kind of effects there are. Is it warm? Is it cool? And you want to put that into your thinking process on creating a image library for yourself. There's also free resources like Unsplash 2 if you don't want to drop a lot of money on this stuff. But that's also why I say, if you can take your own photography, even better. And then supporting graphics. So it's like the logo just doesn't sit alone. If you look a little deeper at many systems, they will have some sort of graphics. Is it circles? Is it squares? It can be basic things, or it can be things that are more illustrative. And in this case, especially using your art would be great. So as photography, as illustration, icons, you might want to create icons, which is kind of like doing mini logos, but they're way more specific. So these are the types of things, patterns, motifs that you could consider including to complement the logo and help extend things. Like I often use supporting graphics to help divide a layout, to separate things into areas of focus or to unify things. So, all those kind of thoughts are what they'd really be useful for. So we go into a little bit of history in that too. So we talked about, things like symbols, the earliest marks, using symbols as language, and then all the way to the alphabets and getting to, digital typography. So that's just a little hint of that. Talk about some of the design Renaissance pioneers back in the day. So, a lot of these are familiar. They've evolved since this point, but I've put them in the context of where they were. And a lot of these have stood. So it's really interesting how something can feel super classic. And, the field is going to a lot of minimalism now, also maximalism, but just seeing how this is not about necessarily doing something that like is mind-blowing, right? don't put so much pressure on the logo because it really is about being recognizable too. So, if there's so much in it, it's hard to pull that out. You want to be like clear, have a certain perspective. Like what is this thing trying to say? Are these lines for motion in IBM? There's a shield and a package. Like what is in there? And what do you want people to put in there? And so these are things that you might want to think about when you're doing these. Like you can notice, the language, for instance, this is the visual language of the peacock for NBC, is really the same shape, just inverted, right? So we're forming that whole, shape and color language to be unified. So a logo, as I've said, it's an entry point or an access point. It's really like one perspective on the brand. It needs to be part of the system. It's a lot of folks might think that it's really the brand, but it's not because it's capturing some perspective, like some essence of it, but it's not everything. And when it starts, you have to put the meaning into it. So it's an empty vessel. And even when you determine a lot of what you want to go into it, people are going to interpret it. So you do want to try to minimize interpretations that you don't want. Like if if it looks violent or sexual or something that you don't want, think about that, right? Like maybe share it with people and get their feedback too. So, and that will be part of what we do in the office hours workshop, like a month after the initial signups. And then also what it's useful for is becoming an anchor or a sign off. But either way, like, your layouts will be anchored to that, whether it's going to be at the top or the bottom, wherever it sits, they're always in relation to that. So finding a good place for it, a good space for it where it can breathe will really help to give it its prominence. And so people do see that. Like you do want them to see it, but when you're messaging it, it shouldn't be the only thing. It's not the only focal point of it. And certainly you don't want these things. So you don't want it to be trying to say everything because then it really says nothing. It's not throwaway. You don't just like slap it on something. You want to be thoughtful about where you put it. So I think like what I mentioned, the interview with Amanda earlier this week, does it go on toilet paper? That kind of consideration. Maybe you make a decision tree for yourself. Like what kind of things does it go on and does it not go on? And that's, equally important. So, don't overdo it, don't underdo it. This is more or less where a logo would sit on a spectrum of different graphics. So it is simple. Um, you can do something that's illustrative, but it becomes something else. It may not translate as well, for instance, on certain applications like small sizes on web. So these are just some things to consider. A symbol is a little more universal. A logo is a little more specific. So that's a general spectrum. There's a little more discussion of that in the course, but just so you know where it sits. These are different types of logos. So these are things to consider as well. Like, are you going to do something that's more elevated, right? So you might go to an older style of type, and it's a word mark like that. So it's called a serif type, which are those little feet on the letter forms. Do you do something that's sans serif, which is a little more modern? You see this, most things these days really are this, unless you're going a little more classic or retro or something like that. Script, handwritten. These are stylistic considerations, but you see how they say different things. Like Virgin is much more angled and like loose. It almost looks like handwriting and has a very different feel than something more formal like a Tiffany. So these are just, once you get all those thoughts about the personality, that will help to influence what you're going to do when you actually render it. So when we get to the ideation, this is the kind of thing where, you really want to look at what makes you a little bit different. So if you have to sit with that and, what is the most unique thing that you think that you're offering? And maybe start there, and then everything else is kind of smuggled into the identity, right? In messaging, like if you're a writer first, maybe that's what you want to say. And then I'm also an artist, or I'm an artist first, or but just find that main focal point that will become the logo, and then everything else can be communicated in different ways. So everything does not need to be in the logo. you can also see how some of these brands have like redefined themselves over the years. So things have evolved. It really does not need to stay the same, but there is a thread of continuity, maybe with the exception of Nokia, because if you completely change your business model, you know, I mean, a lot of them have gone to a really minimal place, and sometimes we can be nostalgic for something that it looked like in the past, but I mean, you really can do whatever you want to do. But do you see how the difference here is this is a representation of a shell versus like this is trying to be a shell. So the difference between an illustration, the evolution towards something that is much cleaner to read and you can get at a glance is something that works well in today's kind of chaotic visual landscape. These are some other things to maybe think about as you're going through your ideation process. So not that you have to sit here with this, but if you wanted to put that up, as you're doodling or whatever, like, and I tend to do hand sketches if I'm going to do, a logo. I don't go right to the computer because then it gets fussy. Then you get into production. If something is really fast, you may go straight to the computer, but I definitely recommend sketching is faster. You can make it messy and it doesn't need to be you get really precise when you're trying to like fuse geometries and stuff online. So I definitely recommend sketching, but think about that, like these general buckets here, like it should be simple, it should feel unique, singular, and then also it's got to tell a story. Like have an angle to that, not the full story, but it's like here's the first chapter, here's the book cover, right? And that's going to attract you to getting more into the story. Here's just an example project, like something I did. I don't even know if this exists anymore, to be honest, but um, so it was a little spot that had a bunch of restaurants and stores in Pasadena. And so I spent some time, researching the history of that. Like a lot of people moved from Indiana to Pasadena in California. And so it was called Indiana Colony prior to being called Pasadena. So there's a lot of history to this. Orange groves and things like that. They wanted sunnier kind of climate. So, some of that kind of comes up. And so these are maybe some initial sketches, and you can see they're raw, like it doesn't have to be beautiful, every one. There's ones that are clearly a miss, and then there's ones that feel more attractive. And, I've skipped an entire thing, but this was an end result. So there's a symbol to this, and there's also like type, which speaks to, type from the day, from orange crates and things like that. And if there are certain things that you don't feel as comfortable with, or if there are people that can do it better, bring them aboard. So for instance, the illustration here initially was done by hand by someone who does illustration for the Wall Street Journal and came up with this dot style. So I worked with him and then did the uh, refinement digitally so it could scale, right? So that can be important too, because this doesn't want to always be small. You want to, so yes, thank you so much. I really like this as well. So this is called from, historical sources, and then I hand drew this and then digitized this. So also working with someone who was able to do these refinements that are quite beautiful as well. So and then the last is implementation. This is just a personal belief. This is what I, go toward. There is a lot of chaos going on, as we know. So, and I don't mind it, but it helps to ground you to have all this organized. So in this last section of the course, we really go through, some of the details that are going to make this next level for you, and also how to help your workflow. So some of these considerations as you go in are going to inform everything else. Like, so once you do your logo and you determine the style, it's going to affect everything else. And that helps your organization. So you can see how, this one's a little more organic in its feel, and that's what's being conveyed. So maybe that influences how you pick your fonts. You could just juxtapose that. You could keep that organic. So we're talking really about production and implementation here in these, like the final touches. Once you've gone from the sketches and you're getting it to a certain place, how do you make those final decisions that make it feel like a system? And sometimes they're variable. So this is kind of fun that you can do something with your logo that extends it. So that's just one little like inspirational thing that you could do. Like, what the Google logo looks like, but then they have these fun doodles, and that gives it a little more play. So here are some things. Now we're getting a little technical. I'm not going to go too deep into that because that's really what's in the course, but we'll start with just this, which are how to optimize that. So you don't want to, do this in a poorly constructed way because you're going to need to put it on all sorts of things. You may need to share it with other people. So if you're ViTra and you have a logo and you need to share it with teachers to promote, right? It has to be well constructed so that they don't inadvertently move the eye somewhere, right? You want these things to be as tight as possible when you're producing them so that there's an easier workflow. You want it to be organized so people know what the file is that you're looking for. So, it's not really just about design. There is the relationships, there's the workflow, the processes, the organization. And these are just things when you're producing that you want to make sure that you've got down. So, you don't want things floating. Like, is it scalable? Can it be on the head of a pencil? And maybe that's not your logo, but you got to find a way to do things that work for what you're going to put stuff onto, your identity. How do you construct it? Like we use grids a lot in design. I won't go into that right now, but it really helps get your structure and alignment because people do notice things with continuity. So if you're watching a ballet and someone falls, people remember that because it's different than what everyone else is doing. So you really want to construct these things intentionally so you don't have the falls. People don't see the thing that's wrong or whatever. It looks intentional. And then how clear is it? How simple is it? How clear is the concept and the rendering of that? So I'll just go a little bit into consistency, not too much because we don't have a ton of time. But these are just some things to look at when you're actually producing things. So, there's curvature, right? Which might speak to how friendly it feels. Round things tend to be friendly, right? So versus angular things. So this all depends on what you're trying to convey. And these are things that both help produce the pieces in a way that is useful to you, but also convey something. So, if you have space between things, does that feel more open or closed, So these are just some considerations to look at. And yes, Alana, that's a great quote. Good design is invisible. If you see too much design, like design for me is actually it's a process. It's not a result. So what you get at the end is a logo. You don't get a design, right? Design is the process of organization, the process of making chaos into clarity. It's a way to communicate. So when you see a lot of design, like it can be fine. Like if you're doing a poster and it's explosive and you got a bunch of color and that's what it's about, cool. But if you're doing design like a product, you don't want a bunch of loose ends. And this ultimately is a product. It's an asset for you. So it's less messy if it's clean and you look at it and you don't like see the design. Like there's a lot behind it, is what I'm saying, that you may not see. The grid, for instance. Um, I'm not always like personally physically organized, but when it comes to digital stuff, I'm very organized. And this will just help to be clear, especially if you've got other people you're working with. But the way that you name your files, the way that you organize your folders, this way you can see at a glance, what these are, because you're creating a library for different colors, like if you do print versus if you do screen type logos. So you've got what it is, what kind of category it is this a horizontal logo versus a vertical? You may have different versions to fit in different spaces. And you definitely have different colors to fit in different color spaces. So you don't want to use your print one for your screen one because it might be dull. So that's a very simple way of looking at it. And then what is the type of file? Is it a native file in Illustrator or is it going to be something that is also scalable but more universal like an SVG? So yes, this is absolutely a time saver set. So it's key. Untitled one just is not useful. And you want to be banging your head every time you're trying to find a logo. Where is it? Like which space is it in? I want to use this thing for a web. You want these cues to be clear. And there may be a README that you put as well with this, but whatever it is, it should just be at a glance. I know what this is. This is a way to organize your folders. You can do it however you want, but I mean, this is what I tend to do both with myself and with clients, because then you have your whole thing organized. Like if it's a system, wouldn't you systematize it, right? Like you want it organized, not just like, okay, now I've done all these components, but I have no idea where anything is. So some people use management programs, but this is a way you can just do it on your operating system. This is how I do mine. So some of this has actually gone away since the point because I've simplified the system. But you might have versions that go on top of an image. So you're going to have a white version. You have a version that goes on white, so it's going to be a full color version. You have an all black version, which can be used for different reproduction processes like embroidery. So, things like that, it's going to be really helpful for you once you start to get into vendor land, when you're sending this off to a printer or you're sending it off to a hat maker. So, when you keep all this stuff organized, it just makes it way easier for you. It's not a headache every time. And then this also helps to organize quite a bit. So you want to kind of like codify your color palette, not have too much necessarily. Like it's not just like picking one red, right? Like you're picking a specific red. That's how Coca-Cola like basically owns that red. Yes, this is totally Virgo rising. That's me, Ilana. So absolutely. It's okay. A little OCD in design is a good thing. So primary, palette, like I was talking about, your secondaries, tertiary, like whatever you're using the most, what does that go into? And these are just different specs for print to CMYK. It's plates, and you don't have to get too much into that. Things like RGB, which is screen colors. And these are just designations, so you know when someone's coding, they're always using the right color. And then there are things, especially, as you're going to scale, like you could spend a lot on this too, but essentially giving yourself some guidelines around this. Now, there can be a formal document, as in this example for Dolby that I worked on. And it gives an inventory of all of these, assets that you have. So you can go through this document and see, okay, this is how I use it. And it's especially useful for, when you pass this off, like if there's friends who are working with your brand or if there's staff or whatever it is, it gives them guidance. Don't cram it with too many things, the logo. So this is like an invisible space called clear space that you don't have anything around it. And you want to find a good proportion for that so that at a minimum, like even when it's in a tiny little space, you're giving it its own space to breathe. What's the minimum size? So it's still, legible, readable. These are things to consider too. So it's not just the creating a logo, right? Because that's the first step. But if you want to really govern its behavior, then these are things to consider. And then this is where you get into brand asset management. So I gave you an easy one with the putting it in your OS, but if you start to have all this stuff as you're scaling, these are worth considering version control as you move through. So that's really a nutshell. There is much more that's packed in there in the course, and I think we've went through quite a bit here. But if anyone has any questions for now on that, I'm happy to take those. Thank you so much for listening.
I have to say, and I've said this before, but this course has so much information packed into it. And all of the courses, they're really incomparable. Like they can't really be compared in that same measure, right? But there is so much in here that you could literally be going through this material and working with it. And like Lisette mentioned a little bit ago, that there are slides that she continues to go back to, and revisit some of the inquiries that they offer us, and so I just want to express a lot of gratitude for Miles and all of the wisdom that you are willing to share here with us. And it's kind of exciting to think about really like the incredible potential that these teachings have to offer any of us as artists that also are navigating being personal business owners, but also really for anyone that is a business owner, anybody that's interested in expanding their visual identity. There's so much here that could offer years of development and continued evolution. So I just have always been really impressed with you, Miles, and what you bring to the table. But this course is really really impressive and expansive download into the work that you've been doing, for your basically your entire adult life, So I just want to honor you and say thank you to you so much for your time today. Not only how much you've put into the course, but the generosity of your time to be with us today, and for the live session that we're going to have on Saturday, June 15th, with all of the registered students will be invited to join. Of course, we'll record it and it'll be in your course content. But I just thank you, buddy. We're really, really appreciate you and admire you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do this. I mean, I think it's really important that we don't hoard knowledge, but are able to share it. And this comes from, some pretty in-depth stuff. And there's even more to go than this too. And hopefully we can do some future courses and whatnot and go deep on certain things, because it's pretty fascinating to me. It's like you can't really unsee this stuff. Uh,
Right.
but it just helps frame your relationship with the world too. To, come up with a symbol for yourself is maybe more significant than people realize.
Right. Yeah, and like I said, the incredible potential, of like how much that this could help you inform, different kinds of even products or ways that you have your prints made, or what kind of like what kind of images that and pages that you might have on your website. It's an incredible wealth of knowledge here, and I'm really excited for the live session on the 15th too. And that's something that you really were so passionate about from the beginning, was to be able to like work with the students and work with artists. This was specifically designed for artists, and part of that too was I remember you saying, because artists are the ones that have the opportunity to be able to do this for themselves,
Mhm.
whereas so many other people in the world might not ever feel like that they would go to somebody for branding, but artists are the ones that are actually equipped to be able to do this for themselves.
And sometimes we don't even think about it, like we compartmentalize things and don't think, oh, well, I'm creative here, but I can be creative here too. And, I'm learning that about different aspects of life, like, having a creative career as opposed to being creative in the way that you live your life.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much to everyone else for coming. And if you have any other questions, we can keep the Vision Train Zoom call open here for a little while. But I'm going to wrap up our live stream for timing purposes. But yes, thank you so much. And if you're interested in this course, I hope that you'll visit us at www.vitra.academy. You'll find the course right there at the top of the page, and you can click to learn more all about it. And we hope to see you on Saturday, June 15th. Um, until next time, this has been Alicia Sacred Heart with the Vision Train. Choo choo!